Hi, I'm Adrian. I'll tell you my story.
I am 42 years old, and most days I still wake up with the echo of who I once was. There was a time when I carried myself like a man untouchable. I had a career that made people nod with respect, a name that opened doors, and enough wealth to believe the ground beneath me would never shift. That illusion shattered in ways I never imagined possible. What hurts the most is not the loss itself, but the hands that pushed me down, hands that shared my blood. It's strange how quickly a life can be dismantled. One decision, one whispered lie, one document signed in the shadows, and everything I had built over decades was stripped away. I had trusted them blindly, thinking family was the one fortress no storm could breach. But they knew my weaknesses, and they used them mercilessly. By the time I realized, the house I had built with ambition and pride was already burning. I don't speak these words to dwell on pity. Pity is useless. But when you are forced to start again, at an age where most men are already settled, you cannot help but reflect on the weight of betrayal. My fall was not a stumble, it was a plunge into an abyss. My finances dissolved, my professional reputation was dragged through the mud, and even the people who once praised me began to vanish, one by one, like lights in a city during a blackout. In the beginning, I tried to resist. I clung to the remnants of what I had. But the more I fought, the more it slipped through my fingers. It was like standing in the ocean against a rising tide, inevitable, overwhelming. There came a night when I sat alone in a room stripped bare of furniture, staring at walls that seemed to press inward, and I realized I had nothing left to lose. That night, something inside me broke, but in that breaking, another voice whispered, "You are still alive. As long as you breathe, you are not finished." It would be comforting to say that I stood up the very next morning, full of resolve and energy. The truth is uglier. I spent days, weeks, even months drifting in despair. My body moved, but my soul was anchored in bitterness. I wandered through streets with pockets nearly empty, listening to strangers speak of dreams while I carried only ashes. Yet in those long, silent hours, I began to see myself clearly for the first time. Without the titles, the possessions, the false admirers, what remained? A man, wounded and aging, yes, but also a man who had once built greatness from nothing. If I had done it before, perhaps I could do it again. That thought was the seed, small, fragile, almost laughable. But it grew. Every insult, every cold shoulder, every reminder of what I had lost watered it. I began to think not only of survival, but of reclaiming something deeper than money or status. I wanted to reclaim myself. So this is where my story begins, not at the peak I once stood on, but at the ruins where I was left. I will not glorify my past, nor erase the betrayal. Both are carved into me. But what matters is what I chose to do after being stripped bare. My journey back to the light did not begin with triumph. It began with shadows, silence, and the stubborn refusal to vanish. When the collapse was complete, life became a series of humiliations. Every day carried the weight of reminders that I was no longer who I once was. It was in the way people looked at me, in the silence of phones that once rang endlessly, in the sudden politeness of strangers who now regarded me with a mixture of suspicion and pity. The world had not changed, but my position in it had vanished. There is a peculiar cruelty in how society treats the fallen. When you are strong, they flock to you like moths to a flame. When you stumble, they scatter, fearful of being associated with your failure. I used to be greeted with firm handshakes, with smiles sharpened by admiration. Now I was met with thin smiles that hid discomfort, or worse, the cold indifference of those who walked past, as though I were invisible. I remember standing in line at a small shop, counting coins in my palm, while the cashier tapped her fingers impatiently. The man behind me sighed loudly, as if my slowness was a burden to him. A year earlier, people would have rushed to greet me, to impress me, to linger in my presence. That day, I was just another inconvenience, an obstacle in someone else's routine. I slipped the coins across the counter and left without a word, but inside my chest, something twisted painfully. These moments multiplied. Former colleagues avoided eye contact when they saw me on the street. Neighbors whispered as I passed, their voices muffled but their eyes sharp. Even distant acquaintances who once spoke of my achievements now seemed eager to rewrite history, claiming they had always seen my downfall coming. I became a cautionary tale, a whispered example of what happens when fortune turns. At night, the silence was unbearable. Without the endless flow of work, meetings, and obligations, the hours stretched like deserts. I sat in the half-light of my room, listening to the ticking of an old clock, feeling each second scrape across me like sandpaper. My thoughts circled endlessly, accusing, replaying every mistake, every misplaced trust. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it was heavy with dreams of the life I had lost. Anger was my companion. I carried it like a stone inside my chest, heavy and unrelenting. Sometimes it burned against my ribs, urging me to lash out, to confront those who had stolen so much. But anger alone could not build anything. It was fire without wood, flame without purpose. It kept me alive, yes, but it also threatened to consume me if I let it. And yet, amidst the bitterness, a strange clarity began to take form. Each humiliation, each cold glance was like a mirror reflecting back not just their judgment, but also my own weakness. I had let them define me, let their betrayal shape the boundaries of my existence. If I continued this way, then they would win, not only over my wealth and career, but over my spirit. There were mornings when I did not want to rise from the bed. My body ached with exhaustion, my mind with despair, but something always dragged me up. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps the faint memory of the man I used to be. I forced myself to walk, to breathe, to face the streets that mocked me. Each day I endured was, in its own way, a quiet victory. I realized then that survival itself was a form of defiance. To keep standing while others expected me to vanish was to declare silently but firmly, I am not done. They might not hear it, but I did. In that recognition, the first traces of strength began to return. Small, fragile, but real. The world had turned its back, but I still had my will. And as long as I had that, I had a chance. I had grown used to silence, to the rhythm of days that bled into one another without meaning. Despair had a way of disguising itself as routine. Wake, wander, endure, collapse, repeat. But life, unpredictable as it is, does not let even the broken stay still forever. One morning, I stumbled upon a chance, so small, so trivial, that most people would have ignored it without a second thought. For me, it was the first crack of light in a wall of endless shadow. It began with a notice, pinned crookedly to a worn wooden board near a market I often passed. A simple request. Help was needed for menial work, tasks no one wanted, but someone had to do. The pay was almost nothing, the kind of amount I once would have tossed carelessly on a restaurant table as a tip. I stood there staring at the paper far longer than I should have, torn between pride and hunger. My pride told me I was above this. Hunger reminded me that pride could not fill an empty stomach. I tore the notice down and folded it into my pocket. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though I had just stolen a piece of my own dignity. That night I wrestled with the decision. Would this make me smaller in the eyes of others? Perhaps. But then I asked myself, whose eyes mattered anymore? The ones that betrayed me? The ones that mocked me? Or my own, the only pair that had to meet the mirror each morning? The following day, I arrived early. The work was everything I had expected. Dirty, exhausting, and unremarkable. My hands, once used to fine pens and polished desks, were quickly caked in dust and sweat. My back ached, my muscles screamed in protest, but I kept moving. For every sneer, for every dismissive glance from those who thought I had fallen beneath them, I told myself quietly, this is not the end, this is the beginning. At first, no one noticed me. I was just another nameless figure, a man filling space. But after days of relentless effort, something shifted. The tasks became less about survival and more about proving something to myself. I carried the heaviest loads without complaint. I stayed longer when others quit early. I worked with a silence that carried its own kind of strength. Slowly, I began to hear murmurs, not admiration, not yet, but curiosity. It is strange how dignity can be rebuilt from scraps. Each evening, when I returned to my small room, my body throbbed with pain. Yet within me a different kind of ache stirred, an ache of effort, of labor that was mine, chosen by me, earned by me. I no longer collapsed into the bed with despair, but with exhaustion that held a hint of satisfaction. The pay remained meager, but it did not matter. What mattered was that I had proven to myself I could still act, still create movement where before there had been only paralysis. For so long I had been frozen, imprisoned in bitterness. Now, even in the smallest of steps, I felt the chains loosening. I remember one evening particularly well. The sun was sinking, the sky painted with fire and smoke, and I stood outside, hands raw and trembling from work. Around me, people walked by without notice, just as they always had. But inside, I was different. My hands hurt, yes, but they were alive. My body ached, but it was awake. I realized then that this was not about climbing back to where I had been. It was about discovering a new way of being, one that no betrayal could take away from me. That was the first step. Small, almost invisible to the world, but monumental to me. For the first time in years, I felt the faint pulse of hope. And though I knew the road ahead would be long and merciless, I also knew one undeniable truth. I had begun walking again. The first step had been a crack of light in the darkness, but soon I realized that light alone does not warm the bones. The road ahead was not a sudden rise into triumph, but a steady climb through mud and stone. Each morning I woke with a body that screamed at me to stop. My palms blistered, my shoulders burned, and my back bent under the weight of labor I had never imagined myself doing. What once felt like humiliation now became routine, though the sting of it never disappeared entirely. It was not only the work that burdened me, but the stares that followed me everywhere. Men I once shook hands with as equals now passed me without recognition, or worse, with mocking eyes that spoke what they dared not say aloud. "Look how far he has fallen." Others whispered when they thought I could not hear. Some pitied me, some laughed at me, and some dismissed me altogether. Their judgment pressed harder on me than the loads I carried. But I learned something in those moments of silent endurance. Their voices could only wound me if I allowed them to. For the first time in my life, I began to understand the difference between working for approval and working for survival. Approval had abandoned me, and yet I still drew breath. Survival was mine to claim. There were nights when doubt crept back in. I would return to my small room, sit on the edge of the bed, and wonder if I had gained anything at all. The wages I earned barely kept me afloat. My body was broken down by evening, and when I looked at my reflection, I saw not progress, but a man worn thin. It was easy to believe that I was walking in circles. Yet, deep down, I knew the truth. Even if the world saw no difference, I felt it inside me. Struggle had begun to carve me into someone else, someone sharper, steadier. The pain in my hands was not meaningless. It was proof that I had acted, that I had refused to remain still. Every insult I ignored. Every day I returned to work when my body begged me not to became a kind of victory that no one could measure but me. Oddly enough, I found moments of peace within the exhaustion. When my muscles trembled beneath a heavy load, when sweat blinded my eyes, my mind grew quiet. The constant storm of memory and bitterness would fade, replaced by a single thought: one more step. There was freedom in that simplicity. The world did not change around me. The streets remained the same, the faces indifferent, yet I walked them differently. Each evening, as the sun sank and the sky burned red, I moved through the crowd, not as a ghost, but as a man, slowly building himself back from ruins. They could laugh, they could pity, they could forget me entirely. But I was learning the one truth I had never grasped before. Strength is not given, it is forged, slowly, painfully, in the heat of hardship. And though I had far to go, I could already feel the shape of something new forming inside me. The road did not suddenly become smooth, nor did the burdens on my shoulders vanish. Yet slowly, I began to notice that the world was not entirely blind to my effort. At first, it was small things: a stranger nodding as I worked, someone offering me a cup of water on a hot day, a passing word of respect rather than pity. They were fragments, almost invisible, but to me, they felt like cracks forming in the wall that had once surrounded me. One evening, I was asked to stay longer, to help finish a task that others had abandoned. I did not complain, I simply did it. When the work was complete, my employer looked at me differently, not as a man clinging to survival, but as someone who could be relied upon. That glance stayed with me. It was not praise, not even gratitude, but recognition. After so many years of being dismissed, I realized how powerful even that small acknowledgement could be. From then on, I pushed harder. Each job I touched, I treated as if it carried my name, my signature. I no longer worked to earn a wage alone. I worked to rebuild myself, brick by brick, action by action. Some nights I collapsed in exhaustion, my body begging for rest, but I knew that the only way forward was through persistence. The whispers of doubt did not disappear. There were still those who laughed, who reminded me of the man I had been and the fall I had suffered. But their voices grew weaker inside me. My failures no longer defined me. What defined me now was the rhythm of my labor, the steady pulse of my determination. I could not yet see the summit. I did not know how far the climb would stretch, but for the first time in years, I no longer felt like a man trapped in ruins. I felt like a man rebuilding a tower, stone by stone, with hands calloused not by defeat, but by progress. And in the quiet of my small room, with the night pressing against the window, I allowed myself something I had not felt in a long time: belief, not in luck, not in others, but in myself. I had not expected opportunity to arrive quietly, almost shyly, like a guest unsure of its welcome. One evening, after finishing yet another long day, a man approached me. His hands were rough, his clothes plain, but his words carried weight. He had seen me work, he said. He needed someone reliable, someone who would not abandon a task when it grew heavy. For a moment, I thought he was speaking to another. Me? Reliable? The man who had once been dismissed as a failure?
stripped of everything. But I accepted. The job was small at first, repairs, organizing, the unglamorous tasks others ignored. Yet within those moments I felt something stir. The rhythm of steady labor gave shape to my days. My back ached, my hands blistered, but with each finished task, I saw not only the work completed, but also a piece of myself rebuilt.
Payment was modest, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I held money earned by my own persistence, not borrowed, not gifted out of pity, not taken from a family account that no longer welcomed me. I remember staring at those bills under the dim light of my room as if they were more than paper, as if they were proof that I still belonged somewhere. That night, I bought myself a meal I could hardly afford. It was not luxury, but it tasted like dignity. It tasted like the first drop of water after years of thirst. And the weeks that followed, word began to spread. People noticed the man who stayed late, who did not complain, who shouldered what others abandoned. Another job arrived, then another. They were small, scattered, sometimes exhausting, but they accumulated. For the first time since losing everything, I felt momentum. I was no longer drifting in the ruins of my past. I was building something, even if I could not yet see what it would become.
At night, I still slept in a narrow room with peeling walls and the air thick with dampness. But now, when I woke before dawn, it was not despair that greeted me. It was a sense of direction, faint but steady. I realized then that I had spent too long measuring my worth, my titles, possessions, the approval of blood that had turned its back on me. Now I was measured by what my own hands could accomplish. It was not victory, not yet. The summit remained hidden in mist, and my climb had only just begun. But it was a foothold, firm enough to keep me from sliding back into the abyss. And as I lay awake in the dark, listening to the silence of my small room, I whispered to myself the truth I had once been too afraid to believe. I was not finished. I was not broken beyond repair. I was climbing again.
Opportunities rarely arrive with grand announcements. They slip into your days quietly, almost unnoticeable, until you look back and realize something has shifted. That was how it happened for me. One small job led to another, and then another. Soon, people began to call me not only for tasks, but for advice, for coordination, for responsibility. I was no longer just a pair of hands. I was becoming a man others could depend on. At first, I doubted every offer. Was I strong enough? Would I collapse under pressure again? But each time, I chose to try. And each time I finished, I discovered that I had grown sturdier. The fatigue in my body no longer felt like defeat. It felt like proof. My calloused palms became a symbol of my resilience. My days no longer bled into one another with despair. Instead, they formed a rhythm of effort and purpose. Money began to accumulate, and slowly. It was not wealth, not even comfort, but enough to pay what needed paying without fear. For the first time in years,
I could look at a small pile of savings and know it had come from my persistence alone. I guarded it fiercely, spending carefully, almost reverently, for I knew what it had cost me to earn.
But what mattered most was not the balance in my pocket. It was the balance inside me. I was no longer the broken son cast aside, the man drowning in the ruins of his past. I was someone who could climb again, one step at a time. There were moments when I walked the streets I had once staggered through, hollow and hopeless, and I hardly recognized myself. Where once I had seen only closed doors, now I noticed cracks of light. I began to sense possibility where before I had felt only endings. Then, one day it came, a larger offer than any I had yet received. A man who had watched me work for weeks asked if I would oversee a project that others had failed to manage. His voice was steady but cautious, as if he too was unsure whether I was ready. I remember the pause before I answered, the weight of the decision pressing against my chest.
"Yes," I said, though fear gnawed at me. But beneath the fear was something stronger. Belief. Not the loud, arrogant belief I once carried in my youth, but a quieter, harder kind. The kind forged in loss, in humiliation, in silence. As I walked away that evening, the city lights flickering above me, I realized something remarkable. For the first time since I had been stripped of everything, I was no longer only surviving, I was beginning to rise.
The road behind me was long, fractured, and filled with scars. Yet as I looked at where I now stood, I could no longer see only the wounds. I saw the steps that had carried me here. What once felt like an endless pit of shame and despair had turned into a foundation, built from hardship, patience, and small, deliberate victories. The man I had been, the one broken by betrayal, stripped of pride and left to wander in shadows, was still with me. His voice lingered in my mind, a reminder of where I had fallen, but he no longer dictated my path. I had learned to carry him like a memory, not a weight. I now had enough to live, enough to stand on my own terms. It wasn't wealth, nor did I seek grandeur anymore. My greatest treasure was the quiet certainty that I could rise after being dragged to the ground. There was dignity in that truth, one no hand could take from me. Sometimes I walked by the places that had once been prisons of my thoughts. The narrow streets, the forgotten benches where I sat hungry, the windows I stared into with bitterness. Now when I saw them, they no longer mocked me. Instead, they bore witness to a man who returned not as a victim, but as someone renewed. One evening, I paused at a crossroads I used to dread. I remembered nights of trembling when I had begged for direction, for rescue, for any sign that I was not abandoned. This time, I stood taller, my breath steady. I realized I no longer searched for rescue. I had become my own salvation. The pain of my family's rejection still existed. Wounds that deep never fully fade. But their power over me had dissolved. I no longer lived to prove them wrong, nor to win back what they had taken. My life was mine again, shaped by my hands, my choices, and my resilience.
As the days moved forward, I found a strange peace in the rhythm of my work and the simplicity of survival. Each sunrise was no longer a burden, but a chance. I did not fear tomorrow anymore. I welcomed it, even with its uncertainty. For the first time in years, I whispered to myself, not as a plea, but as a truth. I am enough. And in that quiet declaration, I knew the man I had lost so long ago had finally returned.